welcome to our session this afternoon. This session is Hybrid Museum Experiences, the Good, the Bad, and the Lessons Learned. My name is Kajva. I am the Educational Interpretive Media SIG's chair this year. I am a trans feminine non-binary person. I use they, them pronouns. I'm wearing a green dress. I have dyed red hair, and I'm wearing a headphone set with RGB lighting, and you can see a blown up photograph of a stirrup jar in the background. And today we're going to talk about hybrid programming. So if you want to go ahead and move to the next slide, Chelsea. So the first thing we want to do is we want to give a digital land acknowledgement. So just as a reminder for everyone, we do live and work on the ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. Please consider the legacies of colonization embedded in the technologies, structures, and our everyday ways of thinking. Digital tools are often not available in many Indigenous communities. Their significant carbon footprints contribute to climate change and disproportionately affect Indigenous people. Together, we can improve this condition. Chelsea? So today we are going to, again, talk about hybrid museum experiences. And we want to start with a quick kind of non-comprehensive definition of what we mean by that. So the general idea of a hybrid experience is one in which there is an in-person component and a virtual component that hopefully complements each other in a way that strengthens the program as a whole. And we hope to actually engage audiences both on-site and online, either synchronously or asynchronously.
Great.
So this campfire session will be focusing on 4 hybrid experience examples, and then we will have 30 minutes of open discussion. And then we will actually be compiling a research document based on our conversations here today that will be shared out during the MCN Slack channel and our own SIG page.
Great, thank you, Kajva. I'm Chelsea Shannon. I am the co-chair of the Educational Interpretive Media SIG. I am also the interpretation manager at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. I am a 30-something white woman with curly brown hair that's currently pulled back. I'm wearing a black and floral shirt, and I'm sitting in my home office, so you can't really see much, but a gray wall behind me. I'm going to be moderating the discussion portion of our session today. So I'm going to pass the baton in just a moment to our speakers, and they're going to give you, again, 4 very short examples before we launch into the broader conversation where we talk about best practices, lessons learned, things that we're still pondering and trying to figure out around hybrid programming. And I wanted to let everyone know, feel free to engage in a couple of different ways. You can pop any ideas, thoughts, questions that come up throughout the presentations into the chat, and that's something that we will fold into the discussion at the end. As well as when we get to the discussion portion of the session, you can engage however you feel comfortable through the chat. You can raise your hand. You can also feel free to just unmute and contribute in that way. I trust the participants here today. So with that said, I'm going to pass the mic to our first presenter, Mark Osterman.
Thank you, Chelsea. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Mark Osterman. I'm the Digital Experience Manager and Head of Education at the Low Art Museum located at the University of Miami. I'm also an active MCN board member. I'm a middle-aged white male. I'm sitting in my office at the museum. I wear glasses, and I have a digital background, actually, of a French painting from 1860 of a sunset in a forest, which is part of the Lowe's collection. I'm going to share just briefly some information about how we're thinking about hybrid experience. And so we're doing it at the Low on every level we can imagine, but what I thought I would share today is how we're thinking about the visitor journey. So in the past, how we conceived of the visitor journey was really driving visitors, our community, our constituents, to physically get to the museum. And we're sort of reconceptualizing that idea of the visitor journey, that it would, at this point, be a hybrid experience, that at all times that journey is both a digital one and also a physical one. So just breaking down these bullets here, ways we're thinking about the pre-visit, the on-site, and the post-visit. I'll run through most of these bullets. So for the pre-visit, we're doing strategic and consistent communication through social media and our website related to the hybrid programming and new safety protocols that we have. We've incorporated new cloud and web-based POS systems so we can do online and time ticketing. That also allows us to do capacity ticketing and also just in general limit physical touch points and build in, as mentioned, capacity ticketing. And we're also really encouraging people now to either use their own mobile devices or tablets that they may bring to the museum, as we've had to pull a lot of our digital interactives from the galleries. When people are on site, again, we're figuring out how to increase these sort of contactless experiences through payments, technology to reduce face-to-face contact and limit touch points. We're incorporating web apps and website resources for self-guided hybrid experiences at this point. We hope to step back where where we're doing both, but at this point right now, at least at the low, we're really steering away from tactile experiences. We've also developed a digital map. The idea behind that is a more sustainable type of map that's not paper-based. It's contactless. The admission sticker that everyone gets when they come to the museum has a QR code that drives people to it. It serves also as a self-guided tour of the museum. And we've also incorporated throughout the physical space of the museum wayfinding devices that help promote social distancing using QR codes so people can do deep dives when they want. Lastly, we're thinking about our post-visit, so experimentation with visitor engagement and how we can have feedback loops with social media. I'm sorry I'm going so fast, but I want my colleagues to have time to go. Chelsea, if you could go to the next slide. So just quickly, moving forward, some lessons learned and challenges that we've identified. So obviously hybrid requires more resources. It's going to and is requiring more digital literacy across the museum and also for our visitors. We're coming to think deeply about our audiences, that digital can serve a distinctly different audience than the on-site. Doesn't have to, but we want to be strategic about how we're utilizing it. We also want to think about when we're doing hybrid programming, whether the digital component is a corollary or it's something completely different, but the idea that digital should not always, or in many cases, it just should not mirror what an on-site experience is. And then lastly, just bringing up that from our experience with digital, we've noticed that iteration, experimentation, and even making mistakes is fine, and that it's actually opened up and it adds transparency to the dialogue that takes place between the museum and our audiences, and kind of relax the sort of the stuffiness that can be associated with the academic prestige of a museum. I'll just mention one or two of the challenges that we're looking at moving forward. And one of them is really focused on meeting visitor expectations. So with technology, visitors really have an expectation of customization, almost instant gratification on certain levels. And so we're struggling to figure out how to deal with that. There are other items in here. I'm not going to go through every bullet, so I make sure that there's time for my colleagues. And I'll give it over to, I think Deb is next.
Thanks, Mark. Similarly, I might be speaking a little quickly. My name is Deborah Howes. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm a white woman with fairly long brown hair and excited to be here with you, standing in front of my fuzzed out office. So there's not much to see beyond me. As many of you know, I'm a longtime museum educator whose primary tool for teaching involves some kind of digital technology. The pandemic really pushed my thinking about how virtual learning experiences could be more inclusive. Frankly, it's a topic we don't address enough here at MCN. A significant number of my graduate students choose to learn in a virtual asynchronous graduate program because they experience social anxiety or maybe dyslexia or some other kind of physical, emotional, or cognitive barriers. People who struggle to hear, see, and or learn need more control over how, when, and where they process information. Not addressing these needs means they will likely not attend or return. Next slide, please, Chelsea. Traditional museum educational offerings, let's just say the classic 45-minute walking tour, are in reality far less accessible than we would like to believe. I hope these 3 examples inspire your hybrid program designs. The first is Arts and Minds. That's a nonprofit educational organization that collaborates with museums in the New York City area to host groups of dementia patients and their caregivers for gallery conversations and some creative activities afterwards. You can imagine that in the spring of 2020, they converted all of their programs into a synchronous Zoom platform. Guess what? Engagement soared now that physical barriers were reduced. Some of the program participants could again belong to this program because they had to drop off when they weren't able to come to the museum, for example. And their faraway relatives could now join in the fun via Zoom. As a result, the participants report that their feelings of isolation are measurably reduced by attending these programs. Second example, which is sort of titled here, Synchronous and Listening. Synchronous is really good for listening and for practicing our listening skills. Thanks to an IMLS Cares grant, the Gilcrease Museum can now make oral histories documenting the lives of African-American survivors of the 1921 Tulsa race riot more accessible to teachers, students, and others. Hearing stories of struggle and success are super important for developing resilience, building listening skills, and growing capacities for empathy in our young visitors. My third example comes from the Texas Association of Museums. They were integrating asynchronous and synchronous learning experiences right away when the pandemic started, similar to us here at MCN. Their goal, though, is to support digital literacy development. Us too, but they've taken an approach where they've really tried to reduce a lot of the barriers for their membership. I know that technology is often considered a cold medium, but with their kinds of programming, their emphasis is really on building community around the learning. And since it's about getting people used to and using technology in a better and smarter way, they can really create some communities of practice within their membership as they go through the different programs that TAM offers. Those are just 3 little windows into how technology really can underline important inclusive learning. And I'd be happy to answer more questions later, but now I'm going to hand it off to Victoria.
Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Waldron. My pronouns are she, her. I work at the Albany Institute of History and Art as the museum educator, and I am a white woman in my late 20s. I have shoulder-length dark brown hair, and I'm working from home today, so you can probably see my sofa and about 1/6 of Clint's The Kiss in the background. I have a little bit of a conundrum. Along with my colleagues at the Albany Institute of History and Arts, we created the Art Du Jour program during the pandemic. It is virtual, it was born digital, and it is a 30 to 45 minute inquiry-led conversation about art on display in our institution. We do not ask anyone to have any sort of art history background. It is based solely on observation, and it's meant to be a contemplative and exploratory program that was conceived to be a break from the pandemic. So far, most of our programs have been run on the virtual platform Zoom. We did do one in-person, socially distanced Art Du Jour program on our lawn. And I have also researched, written, and produced slow-looking videos on the Albany Institute's YouTube channel. Next slide, please. Thank you, Chelsea. So I suppose this is the point of the conundrum. We are concerned now that we've been in this situation for about 1.5 years. How do we create a hybrid experience that combines the accessibility of a virtual platform with the community of in-person programming? Moreover, how do we meet user needs while recognizing the changed landscapes of museums? Thank you. And I believe Jess is next.
Hello, I'm Jess Rosenthal. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the interpretation specialist at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. I'm a white woman, 30-something. I have brown hair that is pulled back, and I am in my home office today. So I wanted to focus on a specific type of hybrid experience, digital exhibitions. And one thing that we've noticed at the MFAH is that digital exhibitions can take many different forms. They can be extremely immersive experiences that literally transport you into a gallery space, like the Met 360 project. On the other side of the spectrum, they can be very high-level overviews of an exhibition just on a website. They can exist only digitally, or they can be in this hybrid realm that we're talking about, where they are based on a physical exhibition. We've even seen examples that allow online visitors to curate their own exhibitions, and examples that allow a lot of freedom in how visitors explore the digital exhibition. Or there may just be one sort of linear pathway through which a visitor can travel through an exhibition. So next slide, please. So with that variety of digital exhibitions in mind, I wanted to provide two examples of digital exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And digital exhibitions at the MFAH tend to take really one general format. We use a platform called Culture Connect, which is an interactive web app. And we use that to house all of our exhibition images, exhibition texts, and visitors can explore that app really very freely and in any order that they choose. The first example that I want to share is one of the earliest digital exhibitions we created. So our challenge was to design a template to use for future digital exhibitions. This first exhibition was part of an initiative called the World Faiths Initiative, and it was around the theme of light. And it stood out because it was this hybrid experience. It was based on a physical exhibition, but it actually had more exhibition images and text than the physical version. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the second example I wanted to bring up is one of our high school photography exhibitions. And this one really stood out because it was not based on a physical exhibition. This is an exhibition called Stronger Than COVID-19. And although we had created digital versions of high school work that was also displayed physically in our museum, that was not the case here. As I said, it only existed online. And it was really important because it came from a community desire to have this content made available. Next slide, please. So I would like it to take a moment to reflect on the question of why are we creating this digital content? I think it was really obvious at the beginning of the pandemic. The answer to this question was that we needed to have digital exhibitions because people couldn't come to the museum, and we needed to be able to share this content with them. And even after our museum reopened, there was an understanding that people remained hesitant to visit in many cases, and so they needed to also have access to this content. But now we have data that tells us that our visitorship is back up, perhaps even to pre-pandemic levels. And so the question remains of why are we creating digital exhibitions now? And there's a few reasons why we think that it's still very important to create digital exhibitions. Primary among those is increased accessibility and widening our audience base. But also because they allow our audiences to extend their experience of our exhibitions outside of the in-person visit. And they allow our institution to preserve a version of the exhibition after the physical exhibition has ended. And that's it for this one. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. So we are opening up the floor now, right? This is a campfire session. We've given you some ideas to think about, some examples of what we're doing and how we're thinking about this idea of hybrid museum experiences. And we want to hear from you. And again, the goal here is that we're going to collaboratively create a document that documents in many ways all of the lessons, maybe not all of them, but many of the lessons that we have learned in this time of working in this hybrid way. We have a number of questions that we're going to pose to you. Feel free, again, to use the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourself, whatever you feel comfortable with. I'll be kind of trying to circulate through all of those different modes. And I've got a couple of my co-presenters here who are going to be helping me to do that. But if you have something to contribute to the conversation that doesn't specifically answer the question on the screen, that's fine too. We're interested in hearing how hybrid programming is working for you, what's working and what's not, and also where we go from here, as Jess just posed. So our first kind of big picture question is exactly that. What's working well for you now? What do you think is contributing to that success? Letting people ponder the question a bit. The flip side of that, which is our, oh yes.
If you want, I can share just a program that the Low has done that definitely has worked for us. So it's similar to one of the programs that was mentioned. It's an inquiry-based program, but it's centered in mindfulness. And so we used to do on-site mindful looking program. We did it once a month, and we had a group that would come. Maybe it was anywhere between 5 and 10 people would attend. Once COVID hit, we obviously needed to switch, and so we pivoted to doing that program through Zoom. And suddenly our attendance soared. And so 2 obvious reasons. One was it became a lot more accessible through Zoom. And then the other was it was clearly serving a community need from all the heightened anxiety of what our new lives had become. And we had found that through Zoom that it was highly effective still as a platform. So to do this sort of prolonged inquiry-based looking at works of art centered around the idea of wellness. And so at this point, we are challenged with that question. What do we do next? How do we move forward? Does this become a hybrid program, or does it work well and just leaving it within the digital realm? But again, what was and is exciting about this is that it's also a program that, for us, when we think about and consider museum relevancy and community impact, we know for certain that this program is servicing that. So we also want to deeply reflect on how its success is both as a hybrid program, but also in terms of its content and what it's doing for the community, how that can be replicated in other ways and other programs.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And it's interesting that it's in many ways very similar to the project that Victoria discussed, right? This idea of slow, kind of almost meditative experiences with single artworks. There's something there that does work sometimes really beautifully in the digital space. There's a question from Emily Crum in the chat, which I think is a really important one. How are you discussing hybrid models with more senior leadership who are sprinting to returning to normal? How does this idea of hybrid work in relationship to the quote unquote return to normal? I wonder if anyone has any thoughts. Deb, I see your hand.
Well, just an approach that I think, won't be a surprise to educators, and it can be really forceful when presented correctly. I think there's a basic assumption in leadership that there's one channel, like there's one location for your museum, and that's the channel that you program through. So if you open your doors, why do you need these other channels, right? So the problem there is that we all know that there's a different set of audiences that come to the digital programs that may never come to the physical programs. And that's a really hard conversation to start in the right way. You'll have to do it what comes out of your own sort of culture in your museum. But the bottom line is that if you've made, let's say for the last year, this enormous effort to offer these programs online, and you've gotten good feedback, you've got good attendance, why in the world would anyone argue to close those down? Because this is the world that you really have to push into. You're not going to be able as a museum to be sustainable unless you do grow your digital programs, relationships, communities. So this is actually a blessing in that it gave you a very quick start to do that. If you close those down, you're saying that you're going back, not to the future, you're going back to the past, where you're always going to be limited to engagement from a physical visit point of view. And I just don't think that's a sustainable approach. So however you can argue that, but I think from the visitor access point of view and interest and engagement, I think it's a productive conversation to have.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a comment in the chat here from Mary Louise, who's saying that there was a lot of great feedback about online lectures and demonstrations, but then they were asked to stop planning more while the organization took a step back to reconsider their digital strategy. And I feel like it keys into what you're saying, Deb, which is that yes, we need a strategy for doing this. I think a lot of us are seeing that there are real benefits in terms of access to this way of working. But how do we do it in a way that's sustainable, right?
I'm also seeing a comment here from Melissa about how they had started doing outreach programming with schools because schools were not doing field trips to the museum, but still wanted to do kind of in-school programs. And so had started to do these outreach programs to kind of encourage teachers to do more encourage teachers to do outreach alongside the virtual programs to create a more complete learning experience. I think that's something also to consider is when you're doing hybrid programming is not just what you as an institution feels you need and want to do, but also what it is that your audience and constituents can actually like afford and are able to interact with. So again, obviously because of COVID not being able to do in person, and so only being able to have the virtual aspect. So that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, this leaning in is really significant for K-12. Sorry, go ahead, Jess. I think you're going to say something.
No,
Somebody was.
Sorry to cut you off, Deb. I think you're absolutely right. That point about audience, right? Who are we serving and what are their needs in this particular moment, right? And we have some questions in here just about that. What are you hearing from your audience? What are you learning from your audience in this time in terms of what they need? And how does that impact your decision around hybrid programming?
I would like to point out that it looks like Rachel also added to the chat, and she said that there is real value to not staying too attached to anything, whether it's digital, hybrid, or in person. And I think that's a really excellent point to make, especially when we are considering what works best from an audience experience. Then it takes a bit of pressure off of us to try to keep investing in digital programs or investing in in-person programs or hybrid if our audience is telling us one thing or another.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also not to just become like, all right, so hybrid programming should be the default because now we have these, digital materials, we could just use it with everything, right? And then being not recognizing that there are certain programs that you can't do in person and other programs you can't do online. And so kind of learning to use hybrid judiciously as opposed to just relying on it for everything.
Yeah, that why question, why should this particular experience or program or content be hybrid? And I think for many of us, I'm just reflecting on things that are going on at my own institution. There are certain things that have lent themselves really well to this type of thing. Someone in the chat, I might have been Mary Louise, I think, who was talking about bringing specialists or curators or experts in from afar. Maybe it's someone who wouldn't normally have the ability to travel to your institution, but you have the ability to kind of beam them in, right? My colleagues in programming have been thinking a lot about that. It opens up doors, both for your audience to participate, but also for people to contribute to the kind of content creation. Mary Louise also says, we don't have enough information about our digital audiences, how they are similar and how they are different from our on-site visitors. And I think that's a really interesting point. I think there's a lot of info being gathered as we speak right now. I was in a session actually earlier in the conference with several folks talking about some of this data that they're gathering. Martin Schellerberg and Associates and a couple of other folks are working on that question. And I think that we should, have some more data in this realm very soon. I think each individual institution probably has some that they're working with, but it is a good question, right? How are we tailoring these experiences to really meet those audience needs?
I just want, okay, go ahead,
Deb.
Mark. Just a quick shout out to Culture Connect, who did a phenomenal job of turning around a quick survey during the pandemic of what people were looking for and how they were responding and what museums could do. I think that really opened our eyes to the fact that that visitors were sometimes logging in just to have fun, or just to feel a connection, or just to get their mind away from the being locked up into their houses. And I felt like a lot of us were just like, oh, like, okay, we could do that. And then there was this sort of flurry of fun things happening, online from the museum. So I just feel like that's maybe not a long-term answer to the question in the chat, but I feel like there are large scale solutions like the one Chelsea described, but the anecdotal is also okay for this moment.
Absolutely. I think you're right, Deb. Like we're using the info that we have and trying to make the most of it right now. Susie asked, do any of the examples given have ways to measure the hybrid approach to show success? And if so, is it ROI, audience engagement, level of content consumption, increased membership? What's your measure of success? That's a really great question. Does anyone have any thoughts about how they are approaching that?
Well, I can touch upon it. We've been doing that poorly, but it's on our minds. And so when I say poorly is that we just haven't been doing it in a robust way, where right now it's really about numbers, and that's been satisfactory because we were closed well over a year to the public. And so it became a desperate race for us to figure out how are we proving just simply in a quantifiable way that we were serving the public and a constituency. And so that goes back to my earlier comment. I think it was Mary Louise also brought up just how important, right, visitor studies are in this realm where we have really leaned in, right? Digital, to another comment that was in the chat, digital has been around, right? We haven't fully pivoted, we've just really leaned into it, but it's time to really figure out a lot of these questions. And I've seen a lot of dialogue going on, the complexities of how do you measure it? How long can somebody be engaged with the digital format that you've considered they've really attended the program and got something impactful out of it? It's just so different than the on-site experience where typically they've vested that time, they've come to the space, they're going to stay for the length of the program. So just a lot of challenges there. And I'll just say lastly, like for us, we've been looking at our numbers and they've been good, but an example of where I think we're taking we're not thinking deep enough about how we want to do our programming strategically. So our lecture program became a digital program. It's called Low Connects. And one of the reasons that we're definitely going to keep it going now is because it's actually drastically reduced our cost to run lectures. So that's anything from the cost of flying somebody here, to paying security, to being in the galleries, to having the museum open in the evenings. But I mean, that's a real shortcut to figuring out, how we're serving our audiences. That's how we're serving ourselves. So to answer that question, we have a lot of work to do here.
Yeah, that's the question from Susie in the chat that has been backed up by Chad here. Is one of the questions we actually have in our presentation here is a discussion of how do you go about evaluating these kinds of things? What is your kind of metric for success and failure, and how has your institution kind of adapted from that?
Yeah, and Chad makes a really good point, right? It can be difficult to balance the assessment of what people say compared to what they do. And so, how you get at that question, surveys, analytics, how do you combine that kind of qualitative and quantitative? And I'll say too, this deep dive into analytics analysis that I think a lot of us, maybe we were doing some of it before through our work, but now it's like the $1 million question. What are people doing? How much of it? And when and how and why? And I think that's been a real pain point for us anyway, is making sense of the data that we have. And we can say, okay, X number of visitors, but what else? What else can we learn, and what else can we kind of tease out of those numbers?
Yeah, and I just wanted to piggyback off of what my colleagues have said, what I've been seeing in the chat, and just sort of continue to emphasize that, yes, of course, metrics are important. It is hard data. You can sort of see it, you can understand it, but I would also suggest that, as Jacques has said, so I'm going to sort of back that up, the idea that the digital space is not always the easiest. I absolutely agree with what Jacques is saying, that very often different content can be buried. But I would also emphasize that anecdotal information, getting reviews from people about their digital experience, whether it's an email, a comment during a program, is also incredibly important, because not everyone engages with technology in the same way. So what you may view as a 2-minute, sort of engaging with a program, that may not be meaningful to you, but for that person, that 2 minutes could have been very important to them and important for their experience of your museum or historic site.
Then of course the inverse could also be true, right? Something that you think is an incredibly important 2-minute presentation that you put a lot of time and effort into doing and putting available on the website and other sort of other places for people to access, people just don't resonate with it, and then they just don't click on it. It doesn't do anything like you wanted it to.
As someone who used to be paid to do evaluations in museums, I can say that time is actually, from my point of view, not a very relevant measure of engagement or learning. And that even goes back to what I'm, about the inclusion comments I made earlier. But I do think that we haven't, as museums, explored other platforms beyond our website, beyond whatever, enough to take advantage of systems that are out there. I'm not talking about social media so much here, but for example, the two museums that I know most closely, the Museum of Modern Art and the National Gallery of Art, have done a lot of online courses on public platforms like Coursera and edX. And they did experience a huge increase of people signing up to take the courses that are offered by those museums. And in those platforms, because they're designed by universities that need that data, there's a lot of information about what people find interesting, which parts of the courses that they finish the video, which videos didn't they watch, how long they've watched it. We're not anywhere near there, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't push to use those tools more to really get at some of the information that you guys are looking for in a more substantial and I think way that scales more easily.
That's a really interesting point, Deb, looking at other models from slightly adjacent fields. I would advance to this next slide. We're at 5 minutes out from our scheduled end, and I want to pose, in some ways, kind of a wrap-up question, which I think is absolutely what we're talking about now, which is, what do you need? What do you need help with? What do you still need to know? What are you still trying to figure out about this hybrid experience model? And I think this point about evaluation and analytics analysis and how do you combine the qualitative and the quantitative, that seems to be a real need right now, is thinking through that together a little bit about how to make sense of some of this data. And I want to pose that to the large group here. If we think about some type of resource document coming out of this session, what would you like to see in it? What are pointers or things that you still need help with? I'll open up the floor for people to respond to that. But I also want to say that the end of the session is not the end of the conversation. So find us on Slack. Today's Slack channel, hashtag 2021 interpretation-story-education, is where comments, reflections, ideas, additional questions about this topic can be posted. And you can also tag your posts with Hybrid Museum. And that way we can kind of easily sort through it and know that you're talking about things that came out of this session. So I wanted to put in a plug, continue the discussion. We hope that this has been kind of thought-provoking and a way to think through some of these issues. But again, you know, what do you need? What are your things that you're still thinking about and still kind of working through?
And also to jump on what Chelsea said, we also have our own personal Twitters if you want to contact us and talk about this there as well. We encourage everyone to do that as well. And our contact information is on this slide here.
Jack says, I've been listening closely to the creator economy and the tools they've adopted.
Deb says, I'm a huge qualitative person. I was surprised to find such good data behind the online course platforms, which hopefully we can replicate for ourselves.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point.
I think this whole discussion really resonates with some of our struggles around data collection, especially qualitative data, because in an in-person environment, we often do visitor interviews, and that's really difficult to replicate anything and get that amount of buy-in in a virtual environment.
Mm-hmm.
Victoria asks a really interesting question. Do people like the term hybrid museum, or should we look to another term? Does it translate to museum workers do more with less? Which I think is a really good question, right? And that's something that I think has come up in a couple of conversations that I've had actually recently of like, the digital staff in the museum has, you know, that lean in, right? We've really picked up the pace in a lot of ways. What does that mean, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I know we are right at time. I want to thank everyone for being here. This has been such a great conversation. Please continue chatting with us on Slack and in other places. And again, we will circulate the document coming out of this session through Slack, through the MCN SIGs and other channels. So please stay tuned for that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.